Tonight we're going to travel through 100 years of computer history, from the 1880s to the 1980s. And we're going to end up at a point where ordinary people could access computers that were both affordable and easy to use. We're going to do that by looking at a number of artifacts at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View. Now, technology is often developed to solve problems. And we're going to look at a number of problems tonight and their solutions and how that led us to where we are today. I'm Dave Hoyt. I'm a volunteer at the Computer History Museum. I sort of grew up surrounded in a way by the computer business. My dad worked for IBM from the early 1950s until he retired in the 80s. I didn't work in the computer business myself, but I've always loved science and technology and history. So when I retired about 10 years ago, I started volunteering at the Computer History Museum, learning a lot of really interesting stuff about computers and their history, and which I'd like to share with you today. Now, I'm going to be telling this story through artifacts that we have at the Computer History Museum. How many of you have been to the museum? All right. Oh, very good. Well, those of you who haven't, I hope you can visit us at some point in the future. And those of you who have, come back, because there's always more to see. There's no way you can see it in one visit or even many visits. But in November, we opened a fabulous gallery, very extensive gallery on artificial intelligence. And definitely come back and see that. Technology is generally developed to solve problems. The first problem I'm going to talk about was faced by the US census takers in the 1880s. Now, of course, we take a census every 10 years, count all the people, and then collect a lot of demographic information. And analyzing all that demographic information is really hard. In 1880, they counted 50 million people in the census, and it took 1,500 analysts 7 years to analyze all that demographic information. Of course, they did it by hand. All those analysts had tally sheets, and they'd make tick marks for whatever it was they were counting, and they'd start working their way through the 50 million people. Now, the population is growing really fast at the time. Some people even thought it would get to 75 million by the time they did the 1890 census. Now, that would have been pretty amazing. It would have been a 50% increase. But anyway, that's what they were thinking they needed to plan for. They realized if they do it that same way, that manual way, it's going to be, first of all, really expensive. But also, they're not going to finish before they need to do the 1900 census. So they need a new way to do it. So they have a competition, which is won by a young engineer named Herman Hollerith. Now, his solution was to take that demographic information and to put it into a machine-readable format on a punch card, like this. Now, the cards were about the size of the currency at the time, so they could use the same bins and cabinets and all that they used for currency. And he divided the cards up into regions that represented the different questions on the demographic questionnaire. And the answers would be determined whether there was a hole in a particular place or not. And they would punch the cards on a machine like this called a pantograph machine. Over here you see a blank card, and here is a template that had all the answers on it, and there's a stylus over here, and the operator could find the answer and push down in the appropriate place with the stylus, and it would punch a hole in the card. Then they would analyze it. So the pantograph is over here on the left. In the middle is a tabulating machine, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And then on the right is a sorter. I'll talk about that in a moment also. Now let's focus now on the tabulating machine. Notice all those dials there. And also notice this kind of waffle irony looking thing. Let's look at that in more detail. You notice on the bottom surface of the upper plate are a whole bunch of pins. Those are all spring-loaded. And you put a card in here, push down on the lever, and if there's a hole where one of those pins is, it'll go through the hole, contact a cup of mercury, and complete a circuit. One of those dials will be in the circuit, and it'll increment by 1. So you can count all the holes at one time with just pushing down the lever. Now, you wanted to sort the cards because you're going to do several stages of analysis, so you can get more and more granular detail. So you wired up this sorting cabinet here, based on however it was they wanted to sort the cards. So then they put the card in, push the lever down, the dials all increment, and the bin associated with that card opens up, and they stick the card there. Now, how did they do? Well, they counted 63 million people in the 1890 census. Not the 75 that they feared, or some people hoped, but a huge increase over the 50 million in 10 years before. They rented from Hollerith 100 of these tabulating machines, and they were able to process more than 500,000 cards every day. That's a stack of cards almost as tall as the Washington Monument. Huge stack of cards every day. And at that rate, they were able to process the entire census, all that demographic information, in about 3 years. And the final report was 26,000 pages long. So this was a huge effort. So big success. So they got it done really quickly, saved a lot of money, and solved that problem. So Hollerith starts renting these machines to other countries to use for their censuses and to other organizations that need to do data analysis. Then he changes the cards a bit so that there are 45 columns now. Each column can represent one digit, and he changes the machines so that they can do some adding and subtracting. And companies can start using it now for some simple accounting work. Well, eventually he sells his company. It's merged with several other companies that make office-related stuff in 1911. And it's called the Computing Tabulating Recording Company, or CTR. The first president of it was a guy named George Fairchild. He came from a recorder company. He was the largest shareholder. But and by the way, remember that name, because we'll come back to that name later. But in 1914, they hired Thomas Watson to lead the company. He was very successful, and in 1924, they changed the name to International Business Machines. This is the start of IBM. Now, in 1928, they changed the cards to the one you may be more familiar with, the 80-column card. Now you've got rectangular holes, so you can fit more columns in, and they also added some lines on the top so you could code for letters and special symbols. And these became the standard way for inputting information into machine-readable format, really through the 1970s. They were used for tabulating machines and eventually computers for program instructions and data. And in the machines that evolved from Hollerith's original machine became the standard way for large organizations to do a wide range of accounting functions. A typical installation would include, among other things, a card punch machine, a sorter, and a tabulating machine with a printer on it. So you could print out checks and invoices, your monthly trial balances. You could keep all of your accounting transactions on punch cards. And IBM made lots of money renting out those machines and selling the punch cards. But there was a really important kind of function that they lacked. They were good for adding and subtracting, and you could keep all of your data on those punch cards, but you couldn't do complex calculations. And of course, those are really important in lots of engineering and scientific applications. And in the 1940s, we were in World War II. The Army's developing guns for the war, like this howitzer here. And if you're going to shoot a gun and hope to hit a target that may be miles away, you need to set up the gun very precisely, particularly the angle of inclination of the barrel so the shell will go the right distance to hit the target. And the way that the Army helped soldiers do that in the field was to prepare firing tables. This is a sample page of a firing table for a howitzer. The soldiers would estimate the range of the target. They'd look up in the firing table how to set up the gun, and then all the corrections they needed to make for elevation changes, atmospheric conditions like temperature and humidity that would affect the flight of the shell. Now, to make a firing table for a new gun was a really hard job. You had to calculate several thousand trajectories, different distances, different atmospheric conditions, and so on. And that was done before the computer. That was done by human computers, because computers at the time were people. It was a job title, not a piece of hardware. And it would take a human computer about 30 hours to do one trajectory calculation. And if you've got to do thousands of them, and each one takes 30 hours, and by the way, that's with a mechanical calculator to help with some of the arithmetic. If each one takes 30 hours, you'd like a faster way to do it. So the Army contracted with the University of Pennsylvania in a project led by a physicist named John Mauchly and an engineer named Presper Eckert to make a machine to do that calculation. The machine was called ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer. This is a photograph of it. You see the computer is actually all along the outside here. It filled a room that was 1,500 square feet, about the size of a 3-bedroom house. And the operators were inside of it. I'll talk about some of those modules in a moment. But here's a model of it that we have at the museum. Obviously, we can't have the whole thing at the museum because it's so darn big. And also, some parts of it are other places. But you can see it's this U-shaped assembly with 40 modules in it. Now, the critical component that made the ENIAC work is a vacuum tube, which in this application acts like a very fast switch. It's all electronic. It can, current can either flow or not flow, be on or off, 1 or 0. And everything that a computer does, of course, is based on manipulating 1s and 0s. And the good thing about a tube is it can switch really, really fast. But the ENIAC needed 18,000 vacuum tubes. Now, you can imagine the problems you'd have with a machine that needs 18,000 vacuum tubes. First of all, it takes a lot of energy, 150 kilowatts. And then you got to dissipate it or the thing is going to burn up. And also these things burn out. And if you got 18,000 of them, that's, going to happen occasionally or more than occasionally. But once you got it working, the ENIAC could do that calculation that took 30 hours by hand in about 30 seconds. So solve that problem for the Army. Now let's look at a couple of these modules. This, unfortunately, it's hard to get a good photograph of this. This is a photo I took of an accumulator. It's 8.5 feet high. It has 500 tubes in it and 20 of the 40 modules in the ENIAC. So half of the machine was made up of accumulators. They have 2 jobs. One is adding and subtracting. The other is storing one 10-digit decimal number. So the entire storage of this machine that fills a room the size of a 3-bedroom house is 20 numbers. Okay? Now, they designed this for that firing table application. But you could do other applications as well, but in order to change from one task to another, you had to rewire the machine. That's what these women are doing here. They're rewiring it to do a different application. By the way, it was the women that figured out what those circuits had to be, what that wire had to be. It was I've seen some of the worksheets from this, incredibly complex. These ladies were just brilliant. Yeah. By the way, yeah, I'll elaborate a little bit more. The guys were the ones that designed and built the hardware. The women were the ones that made it work. The guys were the ones that got all the credit. But there was a really good book written about, 2 years ago maybe, called Proving Ground, about the women of ENIAC. If you're interested, I recommend that. It's a really interesting book about the women and also about this machine. But you had to rewire the machine to do a different task. The other thing you had to do was to change the position on these function panels. This function panel has 650 switches on it. So you had to rewire the machine. You had to, the women, by the way, had to figure out what the positions of these switches were also. So you had to rewire the machine, change the position of the switches. This whole process could take several days to switch from one application to another. They finished this at the end of 1945. So they missed World War II for the firing tables. But they still used it for about 10 years, and they updated it during that 10-year lifetime. But they used it for firing table calculations, atomic weapons research, weather forecasting, wind tunnel design, a whole bunch of different things. But the guys that led the project, Mauchly and Eckert, didn't want to stay at the University of Pennsylvania and just update the ENIAC and make other one-off kind of computers. They wanted to go and start a company to make general purpose machines that they could sell to any large organization. Now, To do that, there was a problem, because you can't spend hours or days changing from one application to another. The machine that they made was called UNIVAC, the Universal Automatic Computer. And this is the control panel of UNIVAC. But they had to find a way to store programs in it without having to rewire the machine. They did that with mercury delay lines. This science fiction-y looking cylinder, it's about this big around, it's about that long, and it's an early form of computer memory. They had a matrix of 7 of these, and together they could store 1,000 words of either program instructions or numbers. And once they had that, you could then load a program, run it, load another program, and run it without having to rewire the machine. Now, you could also store numbers here a lot more efficiently than in those big accumulators. So you only needed 6,000 tubes rather than 18. It was about a third the size. Now, that's still a lot of vacuum tubes, but a lot better than the ENIAC. Now, there's another kind of storage problem they wanted to solve. That was data storage. You know, at the time, data was stored on punch cards. Imagine you're a big government agency, like the Social Security Administration, keeping track of all workers in the country, or the Census Bureau. The 1950 census counted 159 million people. That's a lot of punch cards. Big companies that had a lot of employees or a lot of customers. Big warehouses full of punch cards. This is a government warehouse here, but basically this was not uncommon. Organizations had big warehouses full of pallets full of punch cards. Time Life Publishing had 40 million punch cards. Now, imagine you're going to invoice all your subscribers. You got to move the punch cards on these pallets into the card reader, run them through the card reader, generate your invoices. Now, that's better than doing it by hand, but it's not really a great solution. And if somebody moves, changes their subscription, you got to go out into that warehouse, find the obsolete card, and replace it with a corrected one. All right? So that's a problem. So Mockley and Eckert wanted to solve that problem. They did that by adapting tape drives, which existed for audio at the time, but not for this data storage application. This was actually the hardest engineering problem they had to solve, because you got to go from 0 to really fast to find the part of the tape that you're interested in, slow down, read it, and then rewind without breaking or stretching the tape. Once they figured out how to do that, you could take all of those punch cards, read them onto tape, make a backup tape, and then you don't need the punch cards or that warehouse anymore. You just need a room full of tapes. UNIVAC could support about a dozen tape drives. I think of this a little bit like a cassette, an audio cassette, where you're trying to find a song that's in the middle of the tape, and you got to fast forward to get there. It was at the time the best solution that there was until something better came up. But so this helped solve that, or make progress in solving that data storage problem. Now, they shipped the first one of these in 1951 to the US Census Bureau. They still had to do that demographic analysis. But it became really well known the next year, 1952. It's presidential election year. It's Eisenhower against Stevenson. Everybody thought it was going to be a really close election. That's what all the polls said. It's also the early days of television. And the executives at UNIVAC made an agreement with the executives at CBS Television to feature projections made by UNIVAC as part of the election night television coverage. They went so far as to make a mock-up of the control panel, put it in a TV studio with blinking Christmas lights behind it. So if you're watching on TV, it looks like the computer is in the TV studio. It wasn't. That was just a prop. But that's what it looked like to the national TV audience. This picture, by the way, is of the reporters actually at the actual computer. So, yeah, Walter Cronkite. So the poll's close. They run their first projection program, and it shows Eisenhower winning in a landslide. Now, that was not at all expected. Everyone expected it to be a really close election. You can imagine how nervous that would have made the executives at UNIVAC. You know, their big coming out party on national television. They come up with this kind of off the wall result. And in fact, they held up those results for a few hours. But it was a landslide for Eisenhower, and really, really close to what UNIVAC had projected early in the evening. They only missed by 4 electoral votes. Now, you can imagine what a sensation that was. This big electronic brain on national television comes up with this really unexpected answer and is right. And that really captured the public's imagination. And for a while in the 1950s, when people talked about electronic computers, they called them UNIVAC machines, regardless of who made them. Like we would call facial tissue Kleenex or a copier Xerox. For a while, computers were UNIVACs. Now, that didn't last very long. IBM at the time was making lots of money, renting out those tabulating machines, selling punch cards, but they knew, especially their Thomas Watson Jr., who took over in the early 1950s, knew that the future was in computers. By the time UNIVAC had shipped their first machine, IBM had 3 computers under development. By the mid-50s, they caught up with UNIVAC. By the end of the 50s, they totally dominated. One of their innovations in the 50s was the hard drive, the disk drive. Invented in the mid-50s, just down the road in San Jose. This took care of that problem of having to find the right part of the tape because you could randomly access data. This is the RAMAC. It was this is the first commercial product with a disk drive. And it was made for accounting applications because you got to keep track of inventory. You got a lot of transactions you got to go in and update and get random data. It was introduced in 1956. It's about this big around. It's about that tall, and it holds 5 megabytes. Okay. And that still runs. We demonstrated on Wednesdays. So if you want to see a 1956 RAMAC running, come on Wednesday afternoon at 1 o'clock. Now, the biggest selling computer of in the early 1960s was the IBM 1401, introduced in 1959, was made for business applications. This is the computer itself here. This is a printer. They sold more than 12,000 of these. 4 of them in the world are still running. 2 of them are in this room. The other 2 aren't available for public, for normal public demonstrations. We demonstrate them on Wednesdays and Saturdays. If you haven't seen a 1401 demo, I highly encourage you to come and see one. They're really, really interesting. But IBM in 1961 had, as I said, they dominated. They had a 70% market share. They had a whole bunch of different product lines addressing all different customer needs, business needs, scientific needs. But they had a big problem. All of those product lines were incompatible. They used different peripherals. So if you made a printer for one product line, it wouldn't work on another one. So they had to make different printers for all the product lines. Different software. That's a problem for customers because if you outgrow one product line, you got to pretty much start over with everything. If you stay with IBM. Oh, they also had different sales forces for each of these product lines. So you might get a bunch of IBM people competing against each other. That's a problem for IBM because it's really expensive to support a whole bunch of incompatible product lines. And they knew that this was not a sustainable business model. So at the end of 1961, they made a rather audacious decision. They decided to obsolete all of their existing electronic computers. They got a 70% market share. They're going to obsolete them all. Of course, they didn't tell the sales force that at the time. But they spent $5 billion to develop a family of compatible machines. Now, $5 billion to IBM in the early 1960s was twice their annual sales. This was a bet your company kind of gamble that Thomas Watson Jr. made. If it hadn't worked out, we probably wouldn't know about IBM today. But in April of 1964, they introduced System 360. 360 because it's 360 degrees in a circle, meets everybody's needs, general purpose machine that could do both business and scientific applications. They used the same software across Initially there was 6 computers as part of that family. They were all compatible. They all use the same software. They all use the same peripheral devices. They introduced 44 new peripheral devices at that initial introduction. They also had emulator capabilities. So you could take software that you'd written, say, for your 1401, and it would run on a 360, making it easy to migrate from one to the next. This is the 360. This one over here that's the computer. It's the Model 30 we have at the museum. It's one of the smaller members of the family. Over on the right are some of the peripherals, disk drive, and tape. You can see that they look much more sophisticated than those first ones that we looked at earlier. So, $5 billion gamble, what happened? Well, generated sales of more than $100 billion, drove IBM's growth for the next several decades. So, huge gamble, huge success for IBM, but also really important to the industry because this is the first really industry standard computer. If you make stuff that works with a 360, you have a big installed base of potential customers. And if you make computers that work like a 360 and you can sell them cheaper than IBM, you have a good potential business. It's kind of like when PC clones came in to the PCs, except for on a million times bigger scale. And in fact, a number of companies succeeded at that. One of the chief architects of the 360 was a guy named Gene Amdahl. He left IBM to start his own company called Amdahl and made computers to compete with IBM and made a good business of it for a while. Now, these were what you'd call mainframe computers. They were in enclosed rooms, climate-controlled rooms on raised floors. The only people that could go back there go into those rooms were the technicians and operators that ran the machines. They were on raised floors, so you could put these enormous cables. They're about, this big around to connect all the different parts of the machines, the computers with the peripherals and all. And the user interface was not super friendly. I talk about user interface here because I'll talk about user interfaces later that are a little more friendly. What you did if you're writing a new program. So you write out your program step by step. You go to a card punch machine and you punch it out, 1 card per program instruction. And you also punch out all your data cards. You assemble them. They got to be in the right order. You take them to a service desk. Service desk people will take it back into the computer room, and then the operators will run it when their queue allows them to, because they got a bunch of other stuff to do. Then they'll print out your results, take the results and the cards back to the service desk. You'll pick it up, maybe a few hours later, maybe a few days later. And then you look it over and you see your errors. Generally, the first few times through, you'd find syntax errors. You forgot a comma or closed parentheses, or you misspelled something. And you got to find the wrong card and replace it with a corrected card, and then you start this cycle over again. Eventually, you find out whether your program actually runs or not, and you can debug that. So this was the user interface for these machines. Now, IBM made a great business of selling those. They made a lot of money selling those. But there was another kind of computer, another kind of market that they didn't really address. And that was for smaller computers for things like controlling factories and chemical plants, or integrating with laboratory equipment or medical devices, or just smaller applications. And in the late 1950s and early 1960s, a number of companies started up to make machines that were focused on that market. The leader was a company called Digital Equipment Corporation, DEC. And in 1959, they introduced the PDP-1. This is a PDP-1 in our demonstration area. They only made 53 of these. You notice it's sitting just on a normal floor. It's got, little cables going between the parts. It's much more simple than those big mainframe computers. This particular one, like I said, they only made 53 of them, but it's maybe best known because the first computer video game was made for the PDP-1. program called Space War, which was written by one of our volunteers, a guy named Steve Russell, when he was at MIT in the early 60s. And we demonstrate this, it still runs, we demonstrate it twice a month. And if you come on the 5th Saturday of a month, and some months have 5 Saturdays, if you come on the 5th Saturday of a month, there will be a Space War tournament going on. Okay. But in 1965, DEC introduces PDP-8. This was a groundbreaking machine. By the way, 65 was the first year that IBM shipped the 360. They introduced it in 64. They shipped their first ones in 65. And that year, DEC introduces PDP-8. That was a groundbreaking machine because it sold for less than $20,000. This was in a time when computers generally sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars or more than $1 million. This made it accessible to lots and lots of different kinds of organizations. And they sold it in many, many configurations. The one on the right over here is integrated with a medical device used in brain surgery. This one here in the center is more of a general purpose machine that would be in an office. This was hugely, hugely successful. They sold more than 300,000 of them. It was also thought of, some people called it the Model T of computing because it made it possible for lots of different organizations that couldn't otherwise get computers to have computers. Some people also called it a portable computer because 2 people could pick it up and move it from one desk to another. Or you could fit it in the back seat of a Volkswagen convertible. It said portable. Okay. So let's take a little bit of a break now and talk about the technology that drove these machines and how that evolved, and we'll see how that made it possible to have the computers that we have today. So you all remember the vacuum tube and the problems of the vacuum tube. Well, in 1947, scientists at Bell Labs invented the transistor. You see this little guy over here, which basically did that same switching function, but it was a semiconductor device. It was much smaller, used much less energy, much more reliable. About 10 years later, other scientists figured out how to put the other components of a circuit onto a chip, making an integrated circuit, and we can see the evolution of that in this display here. We're going to look at a common building block circuit of computers called a flip-flop. We're going to look at that same circuit in different formats. First, in the tube. In this orange rectangle, and I apologize for all the shadows in there, but in that orange rectangle is a flip-flop made with tube technology. 2 tubes, a bunch of wires, resistors, and stuff. It's kind of bulky. On the left here is a flip-flop made with discrete components based on transistors. The transistors are these silver cans. Then there's a bunch of resistors and other stuff on the printed circuit board. Still takes up a fair amount of real estate, but it's a little more compact. On the right is 2 flip-flops on a chip. Now in 2009, on the space of that dot that the arrow is pointing to, which is about the diameter of a pencil eraser, 30 million flip-flops. Okay. Now, in 1965, Electronics Magazine invited Gordon Moore, one of the founders of Fairchild Semiconductor and later Intel, to write a paper predicting the future of the semiconductor industry in 10 years. And he realized that every year and a half or so, they were able to put twice as many components on a chip as the previous period at about the same cost, and he predicted that this would continue. And 10 years later, they realized, yes, it did. And as we know, that became known as Moore's Law. We have this chart, or this display at the museum of Moore's Law. It goes from 1960 down here up to 2010 when this was built, right up here. It's about, I'd say about 10 feet. And the red line is the graphical expression of Moore's Law. There are some dots along here which you can't really see very well on this photograph, But that's what the semiconductor industry actually achieved, and they line up very well. So where would we be today? We would be at the top of the Empire State Building, okay? Remember, those 30 million flip-flops in the space of about the diameter of a pencil eraser was way down here, sort of like at ground level or street level. That's where we would be today. That's how we can have these amazing machines that we have today. So let's go and see how we got from the East Coast, because we've been talking pretty much about things that happen on the East Coast, to the Bay Area. Well, we're going to start actually in New Jersey with the invention of the transistor. These are the three guys that invented the transistor. The one at Bell Labs in Murray Hill, New Jersey. The guy sitting down here is William Shockley. He was the supervisor of this group, brilliant scientist, and also very ambitious. He wanted to be the move up in the management at Bell Labs. Unfortunately, he was a lousy manager, and that wasn't going to happen. So in 1955, he starts his own company, Shockley Semiconductor, funded by Arnold Beckman. And he sets it up in the Bay Area. The reason was his mom lived in Palo Alto. Now, Shockley had spent some of his youth in Palo Alto. He actually went to Palo Alto High School. But when he set up his company, he came here and started it on San Antonio Road in Mountain View. The next year, in '56, he wins the Nobel Prize together with his co-inventors. Now, when he set up the company, he couldn't get anybody from Bell Labs to come and work for him because they knew what that was going to be like. But he was so well known in the scientific community that he could call pretty much anybody that hadn't worked at Bell Labs and get them to come work for him. And he got a bunch of really brilliant people to come and work for him. And they are in this picture celebrating with him at Ricky's Hyatt House when he won the Nobel Prize. Now, that high didn't last for very long, because the next year, in '57, those guys figured out that this wasn't somebody they wanted to work for, and that he was really more interested in doing research than making products that you could actually sell to people. And so 8 of them left en masse, who he referred to as the Traitors 8, and that name has stuck, and they will forever be known as the Traitors 8. There's a picture of them here. You notice the names. There are some well-known names here. Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore, who later founded Intel. Eugene Kleiner, the Kleiner of Kleiner, Perkins, Caulfield, and Bayer, venture capital firm. And the other guys on there did a lot of really important breakthroughs in the semiconductor business. But when they left, they all stayed together and formed a company to make transistors that was funded by Fairchild Camera Instrument. The owner of Fairchild Camera Instrument was Sherman Fairchild, the son of George Fairchild. Remember George Fairchild, the first president of the company that became IBM and IBM's largest shareholder. And I think that's kind of an interesting connection, that the company that ended up really starting Silicon Valley was funded by money that came originally from IBM. So they went and started Fairchild Semiconductor. That was a very successful company. And eventually Fairchild integrated it into the rest of its East Coast company. And at that time, Moore and Noyce decided to leave and found Intel. Others left to found other companies. People left Intel to found other companies. Within 20 years, there were at least 65 companies that could trace their roots back to Fairchild and Shockley. By 2014, there were more than 2,000 companies that could trace their roots back to Fairchild. So that company that started out with Shockley and all these brilliant people that he could recruit grew to the Silicon Valley that we know today. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Shockley's mom had lived in South Dakota. What would Silicon Valley be like today? Now, there was a lot of technology already here, but probably wouldn't have been the semiconductor industry. Now, why am I showing a picture of a comedy club? This is Rooster T. Feathers Comedy Club, just down the road, about a mile down the road in El Camino. Well, in 1972, it wasn't a comedy club. It was a bar. It was Andy Capp's Tavern. And there was another company from Sunnyvale, Atari, that had a new product that they had a prototype of called Pong. This is actually the original Pong prototype in the museum. And they contacted the tavern and placed it there to see how people would like it. Well, very quickly they got a phone call. Your machine is broken. Well, they went out to look at it, and the problem was that it was so popular that the coin receptacle was full, and so it was jammed. Very easy fix. And as we know, Pong became extremely popular. So if you come to the museum, check out the games gallery, and there's the original Pong here, and right next to it is one that you can play. Okay. So now let's go in the story of how we got the computers that we have today, that we all use. We're going to start out with Xerox. In the late 1960s, Xerox had a number of threats. A lot of their key patents were expiring. They were looking at rising competition from Japan. And they saw IBM becoming more and more important in the office. Now, Xerox at the time thought they owned the office. Offices run on paper. Xerox makes all the paper, or makes all the paper copies. Xerox owns the office. Well, at the time, some of you may remember this, I do, there was talk even of a paperless office. Now, if your business is making paper copies, that's kind of a threatening proposition, all right? So Xerox's solution was to beat IBM in business computing. Now that's a really interesting story, but we don't have time for it now. I'll just say it was a failure. But as part of that process, they figured that they needed to figure out what the office of the future was going to look like, right? If you're going to beat IBM in business computing, you need to define what that office is going to look like. So they made a research facility in Palo Alto. The Palo Alto Research Center still exists. Now it's part of SRI International. And they had it far away from their product development and manufacturing areas because they wanted it really to be a research facility. Now, at that same time in the late 1960s, there was a project going on at Stanford Research Institute that was looking at some similar issues. How people interact with machines, all of those kinds of things. And they had a demonstration in December of '68 at a computer conference in San Francisco, which you can actually see on a video if you Google Mother of All Demos. It's very famous in the computer business. And they had a computer in San Francisco, networked to a computer in their headquarters in Menlo Park. They had a mouse. They invented the mouse at SRI. They had two people working on the same document. They were on these two networked computers in '68. They had hyperlinks and hypertext and Windows. No graphics yet, but Windows. So a whole bunch of really futuristic stuff. Well, when Xerox is setting up their Park Research Center, they hire a bunch of people from that project. Eventually, they hired 15 of them. And also a bunch of really visionary people. And people who were like sociologists and stuff who worked at, how people interact in offices and how they work together, and to help figure out what this office of the future should look like. And one of their key projects was called Alto. Now, the idea behind Alto was it was going to be a networked system where there were workstations at lots of different desks, both executives and support people. They were all networked together with a printer. So as part of this project, they invented the Ethernet, they invented the laser printer, but we're going to talk about the computer, actually the user interface. The computer was a mini computer, because that was the cheapest and smallest computer of the time. But we're going to talk about the user interface. Now, this is the user interface for, whoops, wrong button. This is the user interface for Alto. Notice there's a mouse, okay? Yay. They brought that over from SRI. And notice the monitor. It's portrait format. It looks like a piece of paper. That's because they were trying to replace paper with a computer, okay? So they made it look like a computer. Now, at the time, computer monitors were typically black background and green capital letters, okay? No graphics, just green capital letters. This monitor was bitmapped. Every pixel could be addressed. So you could do different fonts. You could do graphics like this video that we've got in the background. You could make the page on the monitor look like it was going to print out. What you see is what you get. Okay? Now, this was not intended as a commercial product. It was a research project. They knew it was way, way too expensive to be commercially successful. They made about 2,000 of them. They used them internally. They sent a bunch to universities to use. The White House had some. A few years later, in the early 80s, they came out with a commercial version of it called the Star. But that was still too expensive, and by then, the PCs were available, and the Star was not much of a commercial success. So they didn't really commercialize this successfully. But they showed what the future might look like. Okay? So let's go see how that future came about. In the early 1970s, there were a lot of people who wanted their own computers at home. Now, that wasn't practical because the cheapest computers were mini computers that cost tens of thousands of dollars, cheap for a lot of organizations and companies, but you could buy a house for that in a lot of places in the US. So that wasn't really practical for individuals. But in 1971, Intel invented the microprocessor, basically putting the processing logic of a computer onto a chip. And a few years later, when those became generally available, a lot of companies started making kits of parts that you could build into your own computer. And you see a bunch of those on this wall here. There were about 250 companies that offered that stuff. What you did is you sent away your money, you got a kit of parts, and you build it to make a computer that, frankly, didn't do anything useful. This is the Altair 8800. It was on the cover of Popular Electronics magazine in January of 1975. And when it first came out, the way you entered a program was to enter it in binary by flipping these switches here. And your output were these red lights. Like I said, not super useful. But when Bill Gates and Paul Allen saw this cover of Popular Electronics magazine, they were in Boston at the time. They flew out to Albuquerque, where Altair was made, wrote a basic interpreter for it. And then if you had enough memory and a keyboard, you could actually program this thing. Now, people got together in clubs to help each other out, kind of, show off what they had learned, help and trade information. One of the most well-known is the Homebrew Computing Club in Palo Alto. This is one of their newsletters. Two members of the Homebrew Computing Club were Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. And in 1976, they introduced the Apple I. This is the Apple I. The board is this beautifully designed board by Steve Wozniak, who signed this one. They made about 200 of these. They sold them for $666.66. You hooked it up to a power supply and a keyboard and to your television set, and then you had a real computer. By the way, if you happen to find one of these in your closet somewhere, they're really, really valuable. So be very careful of them. Now, you can imagine there's a limited market for this, do-it-yourself, home-built hobbyist stuff. But in 1977, 3 companies, Apple, Tandy, and Commodore, all introduced products that were not really intended for this hobbyist audience, but rather for a consumer market. This is the Apple II, introduced in 77. You can see it's in a nice molded case with a nice keyboard built in. You could get it with a monitor, or you could plug it into your television set and use that as a monitor. When it first came out, it came preloaded with basic software, so you could write your own programs. When it first came out, you could plug a tape recorder in and use that to upload and download programs and data. The next year, in 78, they came out with floppy drives. So that was an easier way to get data and programs in and out of the Apple II. The next year, in 79, a company called VisiCorp introduced a program called VisiCalc, first spreadsheet program. And companies in particular, bought Apple IIs, not because they wanted an Apple II, but because they wanted to do spreadsheet analysis using VisiCalc. It was a real killer app. You bought this $1,500 computer so you could run a $100 piece of software. Huge, huge success for Apple, and drove Apple's financial success for a number of years, even after they had subsequent products. But something even bigger happened a few years later. In 1981, IBM introduces the PC. This is the first IBM PC in 1981. Now, the reason this was a big deal has nothing to do with technology. It has everything to do with the logo. In those days, IBM was a computer company. There was an expression in the business world that nobody ever lost their job by buying IBM. Okay? When IBM put their name on a personal computer, even though they didn't make anything that was in it, they just assembled it in Boca Raton, Florida, that told the world, especially the business world, that this was a real computer. It's got to be a computer. It says IBM on it. Okay? These sold like crazy, way, way beyond what IBM ever expected. By 1984, if the PC division had been a standalone company, it would have been the 3rd largest computer company, behind the rest of IBM and DEC, the leader in mini computers. Now, that didn't last very long because people figured out how to clone it. That undercut their business. Eventually, they got out of it. But this really legitimized this whole class of computers. So now we're getting to the point where computers are going to be accessible to ordinary people. But there's no mouse here, right? These were text-based machines, both the Apple and the IBM. If you wanted to move the cursor around, use the arrow key. If you want to tell it to do anything, launch a program, change a file name, anything, there's a command line. And you have to enter a code, sort of like sending a text to your computer to tell it what to do. Well, that's fine for people who will learn that and will put up with that. But if you just want something that anyone can use and it's intuitive and you don't have to think about it too much, you need a better user interface. In 1983, Apple introduces Lisa. This is Lisa here. Now, that was a commercial failure. It was too expensive and it was underpowered, but it has a new user interface. Notice there's a mouse. If you want to move the cursor around, use the mouse. Okay? That display looks kind of familiar, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, this was a commercial failure, but they used the same user interface the next year with the Macintosh. This is the first Macintosh from 1984. And as soon as Microsoft could, because of some legal constraints and some technical problems, they basically copied it with Windows. And when you think about it, all the computers we use today, whether they're handheld or desktop, use basically the same approach. A handheld, you use your finger instead of of the mouse, but it's basically the same idea. Now, where have we seen this before? The Xerox Alto. In 1979, Xerox wanted to invest in Apple before it went public. This was going to be the last chance that they had to invest in Apple before it went public. Steve Jobs says, I'll take your money, but I want to see what you're doing at Park. Now, not the public stuff, because a lot of it was public. I want to see how you're making this stuff work. You can imagine how excited the people at Park were to show Steve Jobs everything they were doing. Of course, they wanted nothing to do with this, but their bosses back east said, you will do that, so they did. And Jobs and some of his people spent 2 days at Park seeing all the stuff that was going on there. And a while later, out comes Lisa. Now, we don't know what Apple would have come up with if they hadn't made that visit to Park, but what we do know is that Park showed what the future could look like, and Apple made it happen. Okay. So we've reached the end of our journey through the dawn of the digital age. Now, ordinary people can get computers that are both affordable and easy to operate. Now, there's more stuff to come. Of course, mobile computing, the internet, artificial intelligence, but by now we've gone through the dawn and are fully into the digital age. So thank you for your attention, and I think we have time for some questions. Thank you. Any questions? The question was the history of the museum itself. The museum itself started, and I don't remember what the date was, but back in Boston, DEC had a bunch of old stuff and decided that rather than throw it away or recycle it, they would start a museum. First it was in their facility, then they moved it to Museum Wharf in Boston. And there are a number of stages in here, but eventually that closed and all of that stuff moved out to Moffett Field, to a warehouse out there, together with stuff that had been collected in other places. And it was in they had it as visual storage in Moffett Field in this warehouse for a while. Then the museum bought the current facility here, which was Silicon Graphics. And this was when Silicon Graphics was kind of going downhill. And they bought this building and moved all that stuff from Moffett Field here. And it was just visual storage for, people could walk around, but it wasn't really set up as a well thought out and curated gallery for a while. And then in 2012, I believe, the Revolution Gallery, which is our main artifact gallery, opened. And so anyway, then there's other parts of the museum, like the demonstration areas for the 1401 and the PDP-1. And then there's some newer things like the gallery for the artificial intelligence. But that's basically the history. It started out in the East Coast and moved here. Do you know about the Babbage machine? Yeah. Would anyone like me to tell you about? Yeah. Oh, good. Okay, good. Because it's a great story. And actually, the first thing I did at the museum was to operate the Babbage. So in the 1840s, there was a guy named Charles Babbage in England who designed a machine, huge machine, to generate mathematical tables. He started making it in England, funded by the Navy, because it was going to be for mathematical tables that you use for navigation. But for a number of reasons, didn't finish it. When his 200th birthday was coming up, people at the London Science Museum, which is where all his papers were, decided to make one to see whether it could actually have been made using his drawings and the technology that was available at the time. And they succeeded, but they only had time to do the first part of it, the part that did the calculations. It was supposed to do calculations and also create printing plates that you could use to print the tables, because because you want that all to be integrated so you don't have to do transcriptions. So they only had so they didn't have the printing part. Well, they used to demonstrate that, and Bill Gates was in London one time and saw the demonstration of it, and the curator there, being on his toes, went to Bill Gates and said, "How would you like to fund the construction of the printing portion?" And he later sent him back a note saying, "No, that's really not in my philanthropic wheelhouse. That's not really what I want to do. But one of my chief technical officer, a guy named Nathan Myhrvold, would be interested in doing that." So Myhrvold goes back and agrees to fund the printing portion, which is every bit as complicated as or more than the analytical portion. This machine is about this tall. It's about, I don't remember what it's about, maybe 12 feet long, and it's enormous. And he says, "Okay, yeah, I'll fund it, but there's a condition. You need to make a second one. I'll pay for it, but you need to make a second one and send it to me. I'm going to put it in my living room next to my T-Rex." Well, somewhere in that process, the museum got involved, and it ended up his wife didn't really want it to be in his living room because it's got a lot of oil and stuff in it, and it smells, so anyway, it ended up on loan at the museum, and we demonstrated it every day, and it was really, really popular. A lot of people came to see it. It was an amazing thing to watch. It was a really visually stunning thing. There were stuff going on. It was really interesting to watch. And we had it on loan every year. It was a one-year loan that he just kept renewing. I think it went from 2008 to 2015, maybe. Anyway, I started operating it in 2015. And we were expecting in December to get the annual renewal of that loan. And he said, "I want it back." And everybody at the museum was crushed. And so we had a wake for it in, I think, February, and we got all the printing stuff so it would operate, because we didn't include that in the normal demo, because you got to clean, the ink, and you don't want to have to deal with that all the time. And we had a wake for it, and then it went on a truck up to Seattle. Last I heard, it was in his incubator company behind locked doors, and only people who could get into the business could see it, and probably wasn't run, because it takes a lot of maintenance to keep it going, and you've got to run it all the time. And so anyway, it's somewhere in Seattle. We really, really miss it. Would love to have that back. Now, in that area where that was, is used now for temporary exhibits that tend to be 3 to 6 months. Now it's that area and some area around that is the artificial intelligence gallery. Which is expanded. It's fairly large, and I don't know how long that'll be there, but I expect it'll be longer than 6 months. It's a really terrific exhibit. Yeah.
Would you like to describe how it mechanically works?
Yes, how it mechanically worked. There was a crank, and it took 4 rotations to make the next number on the table. Okay. And now the challenge with the rotations was that you had to keep it going in a constant speed, but the load changed as you went. okay, as it went through its different cycles. It was done, it was it called it a difference engine. It calculated basically differential curves, and you set it up. You had to figure out, if you're doing, say, a logarithmic calculation, you figure out a differential that covers a certain portion of the curve, and then you cranked it, and every 4 cranks you get the next number, and then once you got out of that range, you have to make a new curve for it. But it was a bunch of basically wheels that were turning. There were a whole bunch of columns of wheels, and you measured and you read them by where the numbers, on each wheel, on each column of wheels.
So it was strictly mechanical.
Strictly mechanical, totally mechanical. Yeah.
Why don't you build a new one?
2 reasons. One is money, really, really expensive. And the other is London Science Museum has all of the drawings, and they don't make them available. I think there have been some conversations about that, but from what I understand, that they aren't willing to do that. Yeah. Well, the question is about Ada Lovelace, who worked very closely with Charles Babbage. And Babbage, his first machine was this difference engine that he designed. One of the reasons that he never finished that, there were a whole bunch of reasons he didn't finish that. One of them was that as they're partway through it, he comes up with another much, much more expansive, huge, much bigger project called a analytical engine. And he says, "Oh no, now we need money for this analytical engine." They said, "Come on already, you didn't do the first one. Why am I going to give you all this money for the second one?" So the analytical engine is kind of a mechanical version of a computer. It's got all the different parts. It's got storage. It's got a processor. It's got all kinds of stuff, but it was all done mechanically. It's this huge, huge thing. And Ada Lovelace was a young mathematician. She was daughter of Lord Byron. Yeah, thank you. Daughter of Lord Byron. And she was a really eager mathematician, and she worked really closely with Babbage. And she wrote Babbage made a talk about the analytical engine, and somebody made an article about it, but in Italian, and Ada Lovelace translated it to English and wrote huge number of notes on the back of it. In fact, the notes were way longer than the article itself. And part of those notes were what some people have called the first computer program, because it was a step-by-step instructions on how to do some very complex calculations, including loops. And so anyway, so Ada Lovelace is actually quite well known in the computing world. We had and we have had some little things. We did have a display in that temporary area where the Babbage used to be that had a fair amount of stuff about Ada Lovelace. It was temporary and it's no longer there. But interesting lady. Anything? Yes?
Does the Computer History Museum include analog computers?
Yes. Does the Computer History Museum include analog computers? Yes, it does. Yeah, there's a whole section about analog computers.
When did those start?
Well, they started long, long ago. I mean, people have been doing analog, computers for centuries. But they used to use them a long time ago for designing ship hulls and stuff like that. But they became one of the more famous ones and more sophisticated ones was in probably the 30s when Vannevar Bush created his differential analyzer. But the analog computers have been used for a long, long time. both mechanical ones and electrical, where currents or electrical current voltage represent answers to various questions. They used them for calculating tide tables long ago.
Babbage machine?
Yeah.
Did you get any pictures of it while it was in the museum?
Oh, pictures of the Babbage machine. Yes, there are pictures. There's actually a video in the museum of the Babbage machine running, and we also sell a little DVDs of the Babbage machine running.
Can you figure out from the pictures how to build it?
Oh, no, it is really, really, really complex. When you see the detail of how it's put together, it is extraordinarily complex. It boggles my mind to imagine Babbage creating this thing in his head and on paper. There are some really good videos if you do some searching online as to how it was made and how it works and just created in animation that are really interesting. That go into the details of like how the carry mechanism worked and but so if you're interested in that, do some searching online and there's some really interesting videos. Yeah.
So this is all the United States? Were there
Yes.
other countries that were also making this progress?
Very good question. Question was, what was happening in other countries? Yeah, because this is all U.S. based. England had very active program. They handled it a lot differently in the war. In here, that ENIAC, when the war was over, the Army made a big deal about that. There was a big press event for it and all. England had a very different approach. They developed computers for code breaking, largely. I remember Alan Turing and what was the name of it? The imitation game. Yeah. Under the Official Secrets Act, all of that stuff was secret for decades. And they actually destroyed those machines and the documentation on how they made them. And you couldn't talk about them for decades under fairly severe penalties. Finally, they declassified all of that, but we declassified it, really early. But those same people, like Turing, there were very active programs at University of Manchester. There was a company it was a catering company, a tea and catering company, that actually went into business making computers in the early 50s. It was called the Leo. It was Jim, do you remember the name of the company? It was like anyway. No, the company the computer was Leo, Leo, and it stood for something, and the L was for the name of the catering company, which I don't remember. But anyway, they were very. This was in the early 50s. They were very early on in that. So there was a very active program going on in England. Germany had a guy named Carl Zeiss, who made computers during the Second World War. Of course, they didn't. That program had other problems. But we do have some stuff about that at the museum, and I think in our warehouse in Fremont we've got some stuff from there. So there was a program going on that particularly this guy Zeiss was running in Germany. I don't know about Japan. I think they had something going on there, but I don't know about that. Russia copied what we were doing. Yeah, so there was other stuff going on.